On the evening of Sunday, April 28th, 2002, one of the strongest tornadoes to ever hit the mid-Atlantic tore through La Plata, Maryland. Tornadoes in the northeastern states are already uncommon, making violent tornadoes of this magnitude exceedingly anomalous. But the most extraordinary part of this event, in my opinion, is just how unique this storm really was. One that traversed mountains and rivers, and one that didn't abide by any of the expectations of typical tornado behavior. Today, we dive into the wildly intriguing and peculiar story of the 2002 La Plata, Maryland tornado. La Plata, Maryland is a city located inside Charles County, Maryland, and for better or worse, it's an area rich with history. This history dates all the way back to the year 1658, when Charles County was officially established and became one of the first ports on the Patuxent River. This history consists of significant figures having roots in Charles County, of which include Thomas Stone, who was one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. The town of La Plata, Maryland was officially incorporated in the year 1888 by Colonel Samuel Chapman. Since its very establishment up until today, La Plata was and remains a very small, tight-knit community. And this is a community that, despite its geographic location, has a surprising history with tornadoes. We know that Maryland is not a geographically favored location for tornadoes, but the mid-Atlantic and some of the northeastern states in the continental U.S. have seen some infamous tornadoes, of which have included the 1953 Worcester, Massachusetts tornado, the Windsor Locks, Connecticut tornado of 1979, another one in 1989 in Connecticut, and several others. But most interesting of all for this video and topic specifically is the fact that the 2002 La Plata tornado wasn't the first time a strong tornado hit the community. On November 9th of 1926, a tornado took the lives of 13 children while they were at school, 4 townspeople, and injured another 35 residents of La Plata, an event that unquestionably marred the community. So it's now with this context in mind that we now move to the year 2002 and a day that would once again change the landscape of the community of La Plata forever. On April 26, 2002, 2 days before the La Plata tornado, a strong upper-level trough is forecast to move through portions of the northeastern United States in just 2 days' time. In association with this fast-moving storm, a cold front was anticipated to help create a dynamic environment, out ahead of which was a surprisingly ample warm sector. Additionally, jet stream winds above 90 miles per hour were expected through the mid-Atlantic on this day, really heightening the environment to become more conducive to severe weather and for supercells specifically. Seeing these main players come together on the next day, Saturday, April 27th, the SPC issues a day 2 slight risk of severe thunderstorms for portions of the mid-Atlantic, stating the primary risk was for damaging winds, but there was a risk for tornadoes and hail as well. The outlook did note that the risk for tornadoes was incredibly conditional, of which was almost entirely dependent upon the degree of destabilization that would occur in the atmosphere, of which of course was yet to be seen. Sunday, April 28th, 2002. The Day 1 outlook comes out in the early morning, and the mid-Atlantic, including the state of Maryland, were now put inside a moderate risk for severe weather. By 10:30 a.m., the hazardous weather outlook now starts to include discussion about tornadoes, writing that the tornado threat was largely anticipated from 3 p.m. until 8 p.m. As the day progressed in the mid-Atlantic states, additional sunshine is now starting to create a rapidly destabilizing atmosphere, with temperatures in the 70s and dew points now reaching the 60s. And if you remember, the degree of destabilization was the key factor in determining whether or not the tornado threat would materialize. With the kind of strong wind shear that was in place, this meant that there was an opportunity for more organized storms that could easily rotate in this environment. In preparation, tornado watches began to be issued from portions of the lower Mississippi Valley into the Tennessee Valley as well. It's just after 3 p.m., and many of the storms that have been progressing eastward along the cold front are now beginning to weaken as they cross the high peaks of the Blue Ridge Mountains. But as fate would have it, that very conditional threat would begin to materialize in the early afternoon hours, while cloud coverage and prior convection had led to a more stable air mass for portions of the northeast in the earlier morning hours. A warm front had begun to move into portions of Maryland, leading to rapid air mass destabilization, and with the overarching kinematic setup that was already in place, a small corridor in Maryland was now becoming the centralized location for a tornado threat to materialize. The Storm Prediction Center now issues a PDS tornado watch at 3:05 p.m. for portions of DC, Maryland, and Virginia to last until 9 p.m. Eastern Time. During the day, several squall lines would form over eastern Kentucky into Ohio, racing eastward. Notably, however, it's around this same period of time that these squall lines are progressing eastward that some prefrontal convection begins to form out ahead of the cold front in the open, warm sector. This prefrontal convection, of which of course included one particular discrete thunderstorm. Considering that it's moving over this type of terrain and elevation, maintaining its structure is quite impressive. As this particular storm begins to intensify, it's issued a severe thunderstorm warning with over 60-mile-per-hour winds and hail, foreshadowing its increasing strength. At 4:30 p.m., this storm becomes tornadic over Quicksburg, Virginia, and it's exactly here that things start to get interesting. Given that this storm is now rotating, the local forecast office issues its first tornado warning for this supercell in the Shenandoah County region in Virginia at 4:37 p.m. For the first time in its life, this storm produces what would ultimately be rated as an F2 tornado in Rockingham and Shenandoah counties in West Virginia. 20 minutes later at 4:55 p.m., after producing a confirmed tornado with both spotter and damage reports, the funnel lifts and the supercell seemingly dies off. But it's in this situation that we know, even if a storm appears to be lifting or weakening, rather than dying off, many times these powerful discrete storms are recycling. These storms, of course, are cyclical in nature. Oftentimes, after producing one tornado, they will simply revamp up to produce another one. This is common behavior for long-lived discrete storms. And unsurprisingly, this is exactly what was happening with the eventual La Plata tornado cell. But it's tricky in this situation, because although this was certainly a tornadic supercell, after having produced the first F2 twister in Shenandoah County, there's a significant gap, almost 2 hours after producing the first tornado, where it's not producing anything again. For the next 2 hours, multiple severe thunderstorm warnings would be issued for this still very potent storm as it progresses through northern Virginia. It's now 6:45 p.m. on April 28th. The storm that's previously produced an F2 tornado in Shenandoah County has moved from West Virginia into extreme western Maryland, and it's because of the long track of this storm that it's been handled and warned by different local weather forecast offices. And that's really critical here at this point in the story, because despite the fact that there was previously a confirmed tornado in Shenandoah County earlier from this same storm, that information was surprisingly never passed down to the local WFO in Maryland. This would be one of few instances of communication failure that's going to be a topic of discussion throughout this entire video. So now, as the warning forecasters in the local office in Maryland are looking at this storm on radar, they're under the impression that this supercell wasn't prone to producing a tornado. From their perspective, looking at the radar only, not really knowing the full history of this storm, they believed the storm to be weakening, unaware of the fact that it had previously produced a tornado. On top of that, Skywarn spotters who had been following this storm since the Shenandoah tornado had reported further instances of not only wind and hail damage, they had actually been reporting funnels coming down from this storm that for some reason were never fully relayed to the local and appropriate weather offices. So by the time this supercell is reaching Charles County in Maryland, despite the fact that it's ramping up to produce another tornado, another severe thunderstorm warning is issued for Charles County, of which included, of course, La Plata, Maryland at 6:50 p.m. This call to action statement in the severe thunderstorm warning did state, quote, "Severe thunderstorms can produce tornadoes with little or no advanced warning." Despite all the myths or misconceptions about tornadoes and rivers and different topography, this La Plata storm was about to produce an incredibly powerful tornado against all odds. Moments after the severe thunderstorm warning is issued for Charles and Calvert counties, just 2 miles east of the Potomac River, the character of the storm rapidly changes, now tightening in rotation and producing a funnel cloud as it moves east. Minutes later at 6:56 p.m., just 6 minutes after the severe thunderstorm warning is issued, the La Plata tornado, not yet warned, touches down just south of Marbury in western Charles County. Moments after touchdown, a forecaster begins to see the new signature on radar, realizing that this is very much the radar signature of a tornado. 6 minutes after the official touchdown, the local warning office issues a tornado warning to include La Plata, Maryland. Just after touching down, the twister is moving through largely rural and somewhat residential areas around Holly Haven. There are several residential roads that are struck here in the first rural areas of the La Plata tornado, including the Nelson and Ripley neighborhoods. Tragically, it would be within the first 10 minutes of this storm that the first fatality would occur at 7:10 p.m. There were only a few minutes between the time of initial touchdown and the time when the twister would reach F3 intensity, once again over residential areas. It's only been a few minutes after the storm is tornado warned, and it's already approaching the western side of La Plata. Just to the south in the community of Morgan Ridge, we are already starting to see some areas that would eventually have questionable violent intensity damage. These areas of intense damage would later become somewhat of a controversy for the rating and survey, which we will of course discuss a lot more in depth later. Tragically, it would be exactly as the tornado moves over La Plata that it really begins to intensify and cause the worst damage of its life. The twister is causing swaths of F3 and F4 damage, the kind of swaths that will skip over some buildings, which, as we know on this channel, is indicative of a multiple vortices structure tornado, indicating violence. These findings would later corroborate multiple reports of eyewitnesses saying that there was multiple funnels or multiple vortices within the parent circulation. Incredibly, this storm was moving at a forward speed of 58 miles per hour, meaning this is all happening just within seconds in downtown La Plata. As I mentioned briefly earlier, There were several instances of controversy within the rating and damage of this tornado, the most extensive controversy of which would come from the eastern portions of downtown La Plata. I'm going to insert a photo here that comes from eastern La Plata, and I want you to look at it and tell me what you think is interesting or unique about this damage photo. Let me know in the comments what you think, and we're going to come back to it later, but I want to give you a second to try to figure out what is strange about this photo. Peak damage from the La Plata tornado comes from the very heart of the town. Dozens of businesses are hammered by this storm, of which included a lumber yard that would pick up so much debris and lumber that it caused catastrophic damage to other buildings around it that were subjected to launched piles of wood. Immediately after moving east of La Plata, the tornado was about to cross through an extensive period of rural land. And despite the fact that this is largely rural areas, there were over 100 homes that were struck by the La Plata tornado at varying intensities. In total, over 50 businesses and dozens of barns were destroyed in conjunction with the over 100 homes. But this tornado isn't done being incredibly fascinating. It's just after moving over the community of Benedict that the twister crosses the Patuxent River. I know, and we know, that tornadoes can and do and have crossed rivers before, but it doesn't take away the fact that it is still very impressive for a storm to not only do that, but to maintain its intensity as it does so, which is exactly what the La Plata tornado did. On the other side of the river, the community of Birch was struck. The Calvert Mobile Home Park on Halloween Point Road was additionally struck. And once again, it's after crossing over the Western Shore Estates that the twister moves over the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay. Once again, not only does it move over the Chesapeake Bay, it lands on shore in Walnut Landing and maintains its intensity. There would be several more minutes of rural landscape that were destroyed, many trees and forests that were destroyed, more rural homes, and one more river that it's crossed before finally starting to weaken. And finally, fortunately, the twister dissipates before it reaches the western portions of the metro community of Salisbury. In total, this impressive storm traversed a total of 64 miles across southeastern Maryland, crossing rivers, mountain ranges, reaching violent intensity, and being a long track twister against all odds. In total, the tornado caused some $115 million in damage in this smaller community and the other rural communities that were impacted as well. The aftermath and initial recovery efforts were oversaw by, of course, the local emergency management, the Charles County Emergency Manager Director, Don McGuire, and Calvert County Emergency Management Director, Don Hall, who did an incredible job at overseeing and participating in the initial cleanup and recovery efforts in response to what is an incredibly unusual event for them. In the wake of the storm, Governor Glendenberg declared a state of emergency in Charles, Calvert, and Dorchester counties. In the aftermath, the Red Cross helped place several families in nearby hotels. Just 2 days after the storm, 90% of the debris was cleaned off the roads, opening traffic back up to the area. In total, 3 fatalities occurred from this event. We discussed the one occurring shortly after the tornado began, which was a 51-year-old male in a permanent home. The other 2 tragically were a couple that we discussed, aged 68 and 65 respectively, also in a permanent home at 7:30 p.m. In total, there were 120 plus injuries, which is quite a lot in my opinion. It's also worth noting that there was baseball-sized hail in association with this storm, which I am confident was responsible for some, if not many, of those injuries. Outside of the most intense damage that occurred in the heart of La Plata, most of the residential damage was sustained during the extensive periods of rural stretch that the twister moved through, which also meant that there were acres and acres of dense forest and landscape that were leveled or completely ruined.
And at the time, they thought it might be an F5. It actually was an F4 or an EF5. On the news scale, it actually is an EF5.
Now we're going to move on to the survey of the La Plata tornado because it is the bulk of the research. It has the most insight into the storm and what happened, particularly with the rating and the communication oversights that occurred during this event. And I know you guys are going to really enjoy this one, so I'm going to have a link to it in the description below if you want to check it out yourself. There is so much more information in there than I'm able to cover in a shorter video. On Monday, April 29th, 2002, the day after the twister, the Washington and Baltimore weather offices surveyed the damage from the La Plata storm. Briefly, the way that this worked at the time is that whenever there would be a tornado in an area, the local weather office would go out to survey the storm. They would then give their preliminary rating, and if it wasn't an incredibly intense or anomalous storm, then the preliminary rating from the local office would just be the rating that is based on their own expertise at that office. However, if a storm is particularly intense or needs additional assessment, then they will bring in the official National Weather Service experts to come out and assist in coming up with a final survey and rating. So after going out and conducting this survey, the local forecast office goes back and looks at their findings and have concluded that they believed the worst damage in La Plata to be of F5 intensity. They come up with an F5 rating. And the key words that should really be used here are that it's a preliminary rating. It's not the final rating. It is a preliminary F5. And of course, when you're talking about tornado ratings, the word preliminary itself is very important because without it, it insinuates that an F5 tornado is a final rating of an F5 tornado. But this is a 40-page survey for a reason. In the next coming days, this information, without the word preliminary, was then given to the public and to the media through public information statements, and a story was further prepared by the National Weather Service Public Affairs Office without the use of the word preliminary. These offices came out and said that they didn't use the word preliminary because they were unaware that there would be an additional survey, which is understandable. However, for a tornado of this magnitude, for there to be an F5 rated twister in Maryland, I would imagine they really could have used that foresight to know that this would be a big deal. This, of course, was a misstep on the public-facing areas of the National Weather Service, and they had to go back and rectify what they really meant, which was that this was a preliminary rating. Not long after the local level survey done by the Baltimore, Maryland offices, it was determined that an additional survey team of specialists would need to come out to further corroborate the F5 rating. Of this assessment team also included legendary scientist Tim Marshall, as we all know, Additionally, given the anomalous nature of this event, FEMA's Building Performance Assessment Team, BPAT, and the Wind Engineering Council, WORK, all came out to conduct their individual surveys for various reasons, and this community really loves acronyms, as we can see. As we mentioned, east of La Plata was the area of damage that was originally deemed to be F5 intensity, specifically the homes at the Hawkins Gate Road cul-de-sac. Some of these homes are noted to have slid off their foundations. Another home was in question on Morgan's Ridge Road, which was swept off or slid off of its foundation. But the mailboxes oddly remained. This is where the mailbox picture comes in here. This is indicative of, as we've seen and talked about on this channel, of a multiple vortices structure where it sort of dances around the parent circulation. Sometimes you will see a home still standing immediately next to a home that is completely swept off its foundation. One of the main focal points for the actual F4 versus F5 damage rating came down to two buildings. One was a brick building in the center of town, which was given an F5 rating initially by the local weather forecast office. Once the assessment team was brought to the survey, Tim Marshall performed a detailed structural analysis of the buildings that were originally given those F5 ratings. He determined that a majority of the damage from this brick structure actually came from large chunks of debris from the lumberyard that struck the brick building. And for those homes that were given the F5 ratings that we just talked about, they were deemed to have been anchored but not adequately anchored to receive that full F5 rating. All of those areas of intense damage after the official team came in were downgraded to F4. One interesting note, though, that I do want to point out, and that many people have pointed out about this event, is that it is using the F scale rather than the EF scale, which at the time, the F scale speed range is from 207 miles per hour to 260 miles per hour, which is absurd. And of course, there are other qualifications or damage indicators that can give a tornado its F4, F5 rating, but the wind speeds alone are pretty interesting. I'm not by any means faulting the local forecast office for having given this an initial F5 rating. I do think it was interesting that they casually didn't mention that it was a preliminary F5 rating, considering how anomalous this entire event was. But some of the extending circumstances that are mentioned in the survey are that the local forecasting offices in these areas, first of all, live in Maryland and they're not exposed to this type of event ever. And the second point to consider is that these offices are trained on doing surveys one time and one time only. They're not given extended or annual training on surveying. They were given it one time and that was it, and they never get to use it. So this rating debacle back from F4 to F5 to F4 is not the end of the world. It's not a big deal, but it doesn't give the local office and the National Weather Service a great look to be publicly making errors like that or having any kind of discrepancies in their communication. But I don't think that the people were bothered in 2002 the same way that they would be bothered today if that happened. Now, the rating was not the only discrepancy that was listed in this survey. As we mentioned, there were multiple communication errors that happened during the tornado warning process that were of note within this particular event. One of the main points that's discussed is figuring out why the forecasters only issued a severe thunderstorm warning rather than a tornado warning for Charles County in the beginning. And they basically found 4 factors at play. There were other issues with the communication that are noted in the survey. I'm not going to go through them all, but they're all relevant. And if you want to look into that further, I'm going to have it linked for you. And overall, the most important thing to consider, in my opinion, is the fact that even though there were some slight discrepancies in communication failures, overall, the warning offices did an incredible job and they got the warning out in time. And the overarching theme that is listed in the survey is that it was a successful day for this office, particularly considering that they never have this kind of extreme severe weather day. I like to think of the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. You have multiple pieces of cheese lined up. They're Swiss cheese, and you might have a hole in this piece of cheese, but if you're going through the model like this, there are redundancies, there are safety redundancies there, so that even if there might be a hole in one part of this piece of cheese, if you line them up, there are multiple layers of redundancy for safety, which is exactly how the National Weather Service does it. "20 years after the event, La Plata, Maryland has rebuilt from this shocking twister. And in fact, the population has gone from roughly 7,000 residents in 2002 up to over 10,000 residents in 2020, which is pretty incredible. Since the twister, a tornado alert system, outdoor warning sirens have been installed in the area. The Emergency Operations Center in the area was also upgraded. Police and first responders in La Plata now have a policy that requires training for natural disasters, and the community, along with thousands of volunteers, really made the rebuilding of the community of La Plata possible. Every year since 2002, the community has a day of remembrance on the anniversary of the event to honor those who were lost and to celebrate the resilience of La Plata. 5 years after the event in 2007, a memorial was erected in the La Plata Community Garden Club. And I love this memorial because it remembers not only those who were lost in 2002, but it also remembers those who were lost in the 1926 tornado as well. There's a beautiful marker here, along with several benches. The 5 benches memorialize those who died in 2002, and the 13 school children who died in the tornado, which struck La Plata on November 9th, 1926.
Everyone who survived has a story they still carry.
2 hours for them to find their way back home.
But it's the story of their town since the tornado that they're most interested in sharing.
The recovery efforts really just took this town to the next step, and I'm so proud to live here now. It's unbelievable.
Casey Nolan, WUSA 9.
In the year 2024, the La Plata event is one that I find intriguing because it is genuinely not talked about very often. It's one that I myself overlooked and was not familiar with at all, but it's such a gem of a story. It's so unique and a real story of resilience of the community. And there was honestly a little bit more controversy than I expected from an event that I really wasn't familiar with at all. That is all I have for this video today. I would love to know your thoughts down in the comments, what you thought about the survey debacle, about the entire storm. If you live in the Northeast, I would love to hear your thoughts about this. If you have any personal memories of it, or maybe your parents did, I would love to hear all of it. If you want to follow me on my social medias, if you want to see Blaze more, you can. And if you want to check out twostorms.co, you can see my mission. We are out of stock of a lot of stuff. It's been selling really well, so thank you so much. I am working on new designs, and I'm going to have some really cool new mugs coming soon, so I'll have all of that updated on my personal social medias as well as the Two Storms social medias as well. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye. What is it they say that people who wear lipstick consume an average of 7 pounds of it by the time their life is over? I think I'll be right at about 20. Okay, I have my 7 liquids here. We have water, we have coffee, we have a refreshing lemon drink, and maybe I'll need a hot coffee as well. I have a cold coffee, might require a hot one. Big brain moment. Let me yeah, we're just gonna use that. Cut it. That sucks. and editing. Ooh, what is wrong with me today? Cheese slap. Fueled by cheese.